Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The potter and the broken ceramics, learning from mistakes. I remember it as if it were yesterday. The silence of my workshop at dawn, when the sun barely touched the clay rooftops of the village. The air was heavy with the earthy scent of damp clay and the ashes resting in the furnace, dormant since the previous night. There, among wooden shelves laden with vessels in various stages of life, I found a strange peace, even knowing that at first light, each piece would carry not only the weight of its form, but also the expectations of the judging eyes in the market. In those moments of calm, I believed that if I shaped the clay with enough patience, perhaps I could finally create something close to perfection. But perfection, as I learned early on, likes to toy with those who dare to chase it. One morning, when I opened the workshop doors to receive a special order, 30 pots commissioned by the most demanding merchant in the village, I was met only by the dry sound of disaster. The pieces, which had been carefully packed and taken to the warehouse, returned to me as a chorus of shards. Not one could be saved. The ground before me was strewn with fragments, each seeming to whisper a silent accusation. "You have failed." At first I stood still, staring at that sea of shards with trembling hands and a tightening in my chest. The market loomed, bringing with it the promise of suspicious glances and coins that might slip into my competitors' stalls. For a fleeting moment, I nearly felt the urge to sweep everything away, close the workshop, and disappear beyond the hills where no one would remember my name. But then, amid that heavy silence, I heard a familiar sound, the gentle crackle of the wood in the furnace, as though the old workshop were calling me back. I took a deep breath. Clay, after all, is never in a hurry, and perhaps it was time to learn from it. Carefully, I knelt before the fragments and began gathering them one by one. There was something almost meditative about the gesture. Each piece, no matter how small, bore the imprint of my hands, of nights spent by the fire molding and polishing until the moon gave way to the sun. As I stacked them on the workbench, I noticed something curious. Even broken, those pots were not dead. There was a strange beauty in them, a kind of memory of what they had been, and perhaps of what they could become again. I spent hours in that position, surrounded by shards of clay and the comforting warmth of the furnace. Gradually, frustration gave way to a peculiar determination. I recalled the stories my master told when I was still an apprentice. Tales of ancient artisans who, faced with mistakes, discovered new ways to create. "The clay," he used to say with a weary smile, "holds no grudges. It allows itself to be touched again." Those words echoed in my mind as I mixed fresh water into the clay and felt the cool, malleable texture between my fingers, as if the earth itself were offering me a second chance. That night, the village slept under winter's thick blanket, but my workshop remained awake. The furnace's fire cast a dancing amber glow on the walls, projecting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. As I turned the potter's wheel, an unexpected peace settled over me. I was no longer working merely to replace the lost order. I was molding to remind myself why I had begun in the first place. The gentle sound of the clay yielding to my fingers felt almost like a lullaby, and for the first time in a long while, I did not fear the market's judgment. I simply shaped in silence until dawn. When the first ray of sunlight streamed through the workshop's narrow window, I found before me a bench full of new pieces. They were not perfect, and curiously, that no longer mattered. Each bore subtle marks, discrete lines like scars, yet each seemed to tell its own story. I ran my fingertips over the surface of a freshly finished pot and felt an unexpected tenderness. It was as if those imperfections spoke to me, reminding me that even broken clay could be reborn under patient hands. Then I made a bold decision. I would not hide the flaws. Instead, I would make them part of the beauty. I took a simple golden paint, prepared from pigments I reserved for special occasions, and filled the fine cracks with delicate lines, almost like stitches of light. When I finished, I stepped back and observed. What had once been an error now gleamed with silent dignity. Perhaps it was not what the merchant had asked for, but it was surely something that could touch those who still knew how to see poetry in the imperfect. On market day, I walked along the cobblestone street with a simple cart laden with my new creations. The air was cold, and chimney smoke rose lazily against the pale sky. Some neighbors glanced at me curiously. Others merely nodded in silence. When I arrived at my stall, I carefully lined up the pots, each illuminated by the weak morning sun, and waited. For a moment, I feared that no one would stop, that everyone would seek only the old notion of perfection. But soon, an elderly woman approached, her eyes shining with interest. She gently touched one of the gilded pots, handling it as though it were something fragile, and smiled. "It's beautiful. It seems to have a story," she murmured, more to herself than to me. Then others gathered, drawn by the same subtle gleam. I saw no disapproving looks, only curiosity. For the first time I realized that those golden lines, born of failure, might be worth more than any unblemished piece. Sales began timidly, but with every story I told about how each pot had been reconstructed, more people came forward. Some laughed softly, charmed by the idea that something broken could become even more beautiful. Others watched in silence, as though they saw in that mended ceramic a reflection of their own lives. And so, little by little, coins tinkled upon the table, not just for the shaped clay, but for the hope it carried. By late morning, the same merchant who had demanded perfect pieces arrived. His eyes narrowed as he examined the pots, and for an instant, I feared his criticism. But instead, he carefully picked one up, held it against the light and murmured, "It's different. Maybe it's exactly what my customers need." There was no further argument. He bought half my stall without haggling. In that moment, amid the market's bustle and the distant tolling of church bells, I realized that mistakes sometimes lead us down paths we would never have dared to tread alone. When the market ended and the last coins lay in my leather pouch, a silent relief spread through my chest. I returned to the workshop at dusk, my hands still marked by clay, and my heart as light as it had been in years. The journey home felt different. The village's simple houses, the smells of freshly baked bread and wood smoke, even the sparrow's song on the roof edges seemed to greet me like old friends. For the first time, I understood that I was more than just a potter. I was a storyteller, and my vessels were merely another way to tell those tales. That night, seated before the furnace, I watched the flames dance as though celebrating with me. On the workbench, a few fragments still awaited transformation, reminding me that there is always more to learn, more to create. I smiled to myself as I mixed water and clay for the next batch. Perhaps none of us is truly broken, only waiting for patient hands to see value in our cracks. And under that warm, welcoming light, with the smell of earth and fire filling the room, I felt a profound peace, as if the clay itself had taught me how to live. As night deepened and the village fell silent, I remained there, slowly shaping a new piece. Each turn of the wheel seemed to cradle not only the clay, but also my spirit. Outside, the wind blew against the wooden walls, but inside the workshop there was only warmth, light, and the tranquility of work without haste. I thought of how many times I had feared failure, and of how, curiously, it was failure itself that opened the door to something more beautiful. When I finally extinguished the furnace and closed the doors, I lingered for a moment, gazing at the village's calm darkness. I felt gratitude, not only for the sales or for others' acceptance, but for the simple fact of having found a way to turn ruin into hope. And so, with my hands still marked by clay and my heart serene, I walked home, beneath the starry sky. In that moment, life seemed as simple as a newly shaped pot, imperfect, yes, but full of meaning. And so, as the days passed, I continued to shape not only clay, but also myself. Each crack filled with gold reminded me that there is no absolute loss, only new ways to begin again. The world outside may be harsh, but within that silent workshop, between the furnace's heat and the clay's earthy scent, I discovered a refuge where even mistakes found shelter. And sometimes, when night falls and all around drifts to sleep, I walk to the workbench and trace the golden marks on one of the first pots I saved. I close my eyes and smile. For deep down, I know these lines are not merely repairs. They are maps, tiny traces of where I have been and how I learned not to fear the broken, but to transform it into something worthy of being treasured. The midwife and the secrets of birth, life and death in the village. I remember well the nights when the wind whispered through the cracks in the wooden windows, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and freshly cut hay. It was in those moments that I would see the faint glow of Marta's lantern, our village midwife, flicker like a solitary star in the darkness. No one in the village dared to question her courage. When a child was about to come into the world, be it in the dead of winter or during an autumn gale, there she was, with her cloth bag full of dried herbs, clean linens, and that serene gaze that seemed to hold secrets as ancient as the hills surrounding our homes. Marta did not speak much about herself, but there was something about her that inspired peace. Perhaps it was the way her hands, worn by years of labor, moved with such precision and gentleness. Once, I saw her trudge through the snow to the home of a young mother in labor. Her steps were slow, almost meditative, yet her expression bore an unshakable resolve. People said she knew not only the art of childbirth, but also tales woven of faith and superstition, whispered prayers at the bedside, red ribbons tied to cradles to ward off evil spirits, and infusions made from roots few dared to gather. For Marta, all of it was part of the same delicate thread that bound life to hope. There was something almost sacred in the way she entered each home. The chatter would cease, and even the most anxious souls seemed to find comfort simply by seeing her adjust her shawl and open her bag. I was only a child when I first witnessed her at work, but I remember vividly the scent of lavender and rosemary drifting from her pockets, aromas that mingled with the hearth's warmth and the anxious sweat of waiting parents. To us, she was more than a midwife. She was a guardian of thresholds, someone who walked the thin line between life and death with a serenity few could bear. One night, during a particularly cruel winter, I accompanied my father to a neighbor's house. The mother had been in labor for hours, and everyone feared the worst. Snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the village in an almost supernatural silence. I recall seeing Marta seated beside the laboring woman, murmuring words I did not understand. Her voice was soft but steady, as if she spoke not only to the mother, but to unseen forces hovering in that room. And when at last the baby's cry shattered the stillness, Marta's eyes glowed like embers in the dark. That night, I saw a change come over everyone present. The men, usually stoic and reserved, discreetly wiped away tears. The women sighed in relief, as though breathing with one collective heart. And Marta, wearing a gentle smile, cradled the newborn and placed it in the mother's arms, who wept and laughed in the same breath. Then, while the hushed celebration began, Marta quietly packed her things, knowing she would soon be called again for another birth. She never demanded thanks. Her only payment was the silent trust of us all. In time, I began to notice that Marta did more than witness joy. In her bag, alongside the life-giving herbs, there were small beeswax candles and pieces of white linen, signs that she understood the fragility of beginnings. My mother once told me Marta had lost count of the little ones who did not breathe for long. Yet I never saw despair in her eyes. only a profound tenderness, as though even those brief farewells deserved reverence and care, like flowers left in a forgotten field. Stories circulated through the village, whispered between stone walls and fireside kitchens. They told of the time Marta saved a baby deemed lost, using nothing but a bowl of warm water, an ancient lullaby, and endless patience. She sang to him until his soul chose to stay, the older women would say, crossing themselves. I never knew whether it was truth or legend, but I believed, because when I looked at Marta, she always seemed to carry a fragment of the very essence of miracles. Still, some murmured criticisms. A few men, strict adherents to the church's rules, distrusted her methods. They claimed faith and folk remedies should not mix. But when a mother's pain became unbearable and a baby's life hung by a thread, those same men sent for her, racing across snow or mud. In our village, we knew no one walked more carefully between the world of the living and what lies beyond. And in a way, we all needed her, even those who would not admit it. I remember one night when the moon hid behind heavy clouds and the wind blew as if intent on tearing rooftops away. Marta was summoned to assist a young mother, still a girl, whose labor began prematurely. I went with my father to fetch firewood for the room, and when we entered, I found Marta seated by the hearth, her eyes fixed on the flame as she stirred a copper pot. The air was thick with the aroma of marjoram and dried leaves, a scent that somehow brought calm, as if silently promising that all would be well. That child was born small and nearly silent. The hush was so deep that even the wind seemed to pause and listen. Then, with a delicacy beyond words, Marta pressed the baby to the mother's chest, rubbed its back with steady hands, and softly sang a tune made of notes so simple they felt older than memory. Gradually, a faint cry filled the room, not loud or triumphant, but enough. Seeing Marta's triumphant smile in that moment, I realized I was witnessing something no book could teach, only the patient intimacy of life. As the years passed, I learned to recognize Marta's footsteps along the village lanes. They were slow but sure, accompanied by the gentle clink of glass bottles in her bag. When she knocked on a door, even at the darkest hour, she seemed to carry light with her, warming the cold night air. To many, she was more than a midwife. She was a reminder that despite pain and loss, life always found a way to bloom. One spring morning, I saw her sitting on her doorstep, her face bathed in soft sunlight. She gazed at a field of wildflowers as she wove red ribbons, believed to protect newborns from harm. I asked, still believing in enchantments, whether those ribbons truly worked. She smiled, holding secrets that needed no words, and replied, "Perhaps they do. Or perhaps they simply make mothers believe their children are safer. And sometimes, believing is all we need." Over time, I accompanied her on some visits, carrying small baskets of herbs and clean linens. That is how I learned her work was about more than bringing babies into the world. It was about soothing hearts. Often she would sit beside exhausted mothers, hold their hands, and tell stories, ancient village legends, memories of other births, or even amusing tales of infants so strong they cried before leaving the womb. In those moments, even pain seemed easier to bear. It wasn't only mothers who found comfort. I saw hardened field hands pause at doorways, listening from afar to her low-voiced tales, as if they too needed to believe that despite the world's harshness, quiet miracles still occurred. Marta never judged them. She simply continued, steadfast and patient, knowing each word she spoke was a seed planted in a listener's heart, seeds destined to bloom into hope. There were also nights when hope felt fragile, on the verge of breaking. I recall a difficult labor when the mother lay pale and exhausted, barely able to go on. The room was silent, except for the crackling fire and prayers murmured by family. Then Marta approached, cupped the woman's face in her hands, and said in a voice so calm it stilled even the wind outside, "Breathe. I'm here." We will bring this child into the world together." As if by magic, the young mother found strength she thought was gone. When the baby finally cried, it was as though the entire village exhaled. Doors flew open, neighbors embraced, and even the chapel bells tolled in shared joy. Marta, however, did not get swept up in the commotion. She simply wrapped the baby in linen, placed it in the mother's arms, and said with her serene smile, "Now rest. The rest is just life." In that moment, I understood she was more than a midwife. She was a silent beacon amid life's uncertain tides. With each passing season, Marta became a living legend. Children whispered she spoke to the spirits of those arriving and departing. Elders swore her eyes reflected every baby she had helped bring forth. I, however, believed her true power lay in something simpler. The way she regarded each birth, not as a routine miracle, but as if it were the first and most precious of all. There were also quiet days when joy did not come. Some mornings, Marta returned home with heavy steps and empty hands, yet she never failed to light a candle in her window, as if reminding herself and us that every soul, however brief its stay, deserved to be remembered. At those times, I would see her seated by the fire, eyes lost in the flames, carrying not only the secrets of birth but the compassion of one who had learned to embrace life's mysteries. Once, I asked her if she feared walking so often between life and death, as if on a tightrope between two worlds. Marta smiled with gentle fatigue and replied, "Fear, yes, sometimes, but fear does not guide me. It is the faith that each child carries a story that must be told, even if it lasts only as long as a candle's flame." Her words stayed with me like an ancient whisper, treasured by memory. It was then that I realized something greater. Marta did not see births alone. She saw beginnings. Every cry, every fragile breath, every tiny hand grasping a mother's finger was, to her, a promise. Perhaps that is why, even when sorrow hovered close, she never hardened. In her was an indomitable tenderness, as though each new life reminded her that, despite everything, life would insist on flourishing. I recall one night when the village lay asleep under a blanket of silence, except for Marta's cabin, where a candle still burned. Through the window, I watched her embroider small linens, humming a lullaby so soft it blended with the distant wind. The image was comforting, as if, even when the world darkened, she kept a flame alive for us all. It was impossible not to believe that her light protected more than herself. Over time, I came to understand that the village trusted Marta not only for the children she helped deliver, but because she taught us to view life with less haste and more reverence. In her presence, even the hardest men fell silent, as though honoring an invisible sanctuary built around her. Night after night, amid laughter, tears, and whispered stories, Marta reminded us of a simple truth. Life is fragile, but it is also stubbornly beautiful. And there are hands, like hers, made simply to cradle it. Years later, when Marta walked with slow steps and a bowed back, she was still summoned whenever a new life announced its arrival. Young mothers looked at her with gratitude and devotion, as if her presence were a talisman against fear. And despite her age, she never refused a call. "While my hands can still hold a newborn, my work is not done," she would say with that tranquil smile that seemed to hold centuries more than years. Today, when the wind howls across the hills and the village lies under snow, I like to imagine Marta seated by her cabin's fireplace, eyes closed and a gentle smile on her lips, as if listening to the distant echoes of every first cry she helped welcome. And I think that in some way she remains with us, not only in memory, but in every life that began under the warmth of her steady, gentle hands. Hands that even now seem to bless the village with the most silent of hopes. And so, when I close my eyes and remember Marta, I feel as if the whole village breathes more slowly, cradled by her presence that never faded. She is like a candle that, even after its flame is spent, leaves the air scented with wax and the memory of light. Perhaps that is what she taught us, that life need not be loud to be grand, nor brief to be eternal, and as long as there is someone to tell her story, Marta will never cease to walk through our tranquil nights, guiding us with the same serenity with which she brought so many souls into their first breath. The charcoal burner and the vanishing trees, on work and sustainability. I remember well the silent mornings at the edge of the forest, when mist still hovered among the oaks and the branches seemed to murmur secrets on the breeze. I was only a boy when I first saw the old charcoal burner light his kiln. His face, marked by the glow of the fire and the black dust of his craft, carried a serene quality, as if he understood the language of trees. The air always bore the strong scent of burning wood, tinged with the freshness of dew. In those days, it seemed the forest was endless. Over the years, however, I learned to perceive what the charcoal burner already knew in silence. The forest was breathing but growing weary. The piles of firewood, once abundant, began to dwindle, and each newly felled tree weighed on the man's shoulders as more than mere labor. He lived between two worlds, the heat of the forges that sustained the village and the whisper of the trees that night after night seemed to retreat deeper into the darkness. Still, I never saw despair in his eyes, only an ancient calm, as though he had learned to negotiate with time itself. There was something ritualistic in the way he worked. At dawn, before lighting the kiln, he would walk alone to the forest's edge and lay the palm of his hand against the bark of an old oak. "To remember to ask permission," he would murmur, as if the tree might hear him. And perhaps it did. For in those days, when the wind stirred through the leaves, I fancied I could hear a response, a soft rustle, almost an ancient conversation between man and woods, conducted in gestures and silence. Yet even the charcoal burner's respect did little to slow the vanishing of wood. The forges demanded fire, and fire demanded timber. In the village, few questioned the origin of each spark that warmed the blacksmith's iron. Only the old burner seemed to feel the weight of every tree cut. At night, seated before the embers, his gaze would drift, as if seeing beyond the crackle of flames, perhaps recalling a time when trunks were thicker, shadows deeper, and the wood seemed infinite. Once, on an autumn afternoon, I accompanied him to a seldom visited part of the forest. The ground was blanketed in dry leaves, and the air carried the sweet perfume of ancient wood. "Here the tallest ashes used to stand," he said, tracing his hand over the stump of a long-felled tree. His tone was not one of lament, but of quiet observation, as though conversing with an old memory. I remained silent, sensing that there, among those absent trees, lay something almost sacred, a memory not to be disturbed by words. It was that very afternoon he told me of a habit passed down from his father. For every tree he felled, he would bury 3 seeds in the damp earth. "They don't always sprout," he said, "but at least the forest knows I have not forgotten it." As he spoke, I saw in his coal-stained hands a strange delicacy, the same care one affords fragile things, even while working with fire and ash. Perhaps that was what kept him serene, even as other villagers complained of dwindling wood. He did not see mere logs. He saw roots, shade, and the promise of tomorrow. With the passing winters, however, the change became impossible to ignore. The wood piles grew more slowly, and the burner had to venture ever farther to find mature trees. I recall one bitterly cold morning when I found him seated at his cabin's threshold, watching smoke drift slowly from the chimney. There was no sadness on his face, only a profound silence, as if listening to something others could not hear. "The forest is tired," he said, though I had asked nothing. Those words etched themselves in my memory as a grave, profound whisper. Still, he did not give up. Rather than cut more trees, he began to work with what he called patient wood, collecting fallen trunks, dry branches, and even roots washed up by floods. Some men mocked him. claiming he would never keep the forges alight that way. But the charcoal burner merely smiled, his quiet smile of one who has made peace with the world. "The fire does not ask where the wood came from," he would reply. And over time, his small stack of wood grew again, not through excessive felling, but through the silent art of waiting and using only what the land itself provided. It was in that period that I began helping him more often. There was something strange and beautiful in the way he taught me to see the woodland. "Look," he would say, pointing to a gnarled oak. "This one must not be cut. It holds the wind." I did not fully understand, but I obeyed. Gradually I discerned an invisible order, trees growing to shelter younger saplings, clearings where light fell like a blessing, even roots intertwining beneath the soil as if sharing an ancient pact. Nights by his kiln were even more revealing. As flames danced and cast shadows across the wooden roof, he told me stories as old as the forest itself. He spoke of times when people planted more than they felled, of legends about trees that never died, only slumbered for centuries. In those moments, the kiln's warmth mingled with the sweet scent of freshly made charcoal, and I felt as though we were custodians of a secret understood only in the deep calm of an unhurried winter. In time, even the village's skeptics began to notice a difference. While other kilns starved for wood, the old burner's fire never faltered. "A miracle," some murmured. But I knew nothing supernatural was at work, only a silent respect for the land's rhythm. He gathered without haste, waited without complaint, and so the forest seemed to trust him. There were days when even the birds perched near his cabin, unafraid of the smoke. It was as though the woods themselves recognized him, more guardian than exploiter. One night, as I helped carry a bundle of wood to the kiln, I asked if he feared the day when all would be gone. He laughed, a low, weary laugh from one who has lived through many answers. "The forest does not perish, boy," he said, adjusting the load on his shoulder. "It merely waits for us to learn." His words were simple, yet carried a depth so profound that the crackle of embers seemed to hush, as if even the fire were listening. The following spring, I witnessed something I would never forget. From the ashes of an old clear-cut sprouted tiny seedlings, fragile, timid, like green fingers reaching toward the sky. The burner knelt before them and smiled, his calloused hand brushing the damp earth without disturbing a single surrounding weed. "See," he whispered, voice barely audible, "the forest does not need haste. It only needs someone who will stay and wait." On that morning, filled with birdsong and the scent of renewed earth, I felt we were witnessing a simple miracle, hidden from the world's hurried eyes. In the days that followed, he began teaching other villagers to do the same. Some scoffed at first, but soon they saw that the seeds the burner had planted grew strong, and wood returned little by little. It was not a grand, rapid transformation, but a steady one, like the calm breath of someone sleeping deeply. And as smoke rose from their kilns against the afternoon sky, the village seemed to breathe with the forest in a silent rhythm of give and take. Eventually, the old charcoal burner became a living legend, not for discovering any extraordinary secret, but because his patience transformed everything around him. I would see him wander the woods with slow, almost ceremonial steps, as though greeting each log, each root, each fallen leaf. To him, no task was too small. Even gathering dry branches felt like an act of gratitude, and when we returned with our bundles, the air smelled of moss and wood, imparting a peacefulness that defies explanation. On one such walk, I asked if he ever thought of retiring. He chuckled, stroked his dark beard, and gazed at the distant tree line. "As long as the forest stands, I will work, and when it rests, I will wait for its return." Those words, spoken with such simplicity, remained in me like a promise. It was not merely a craft, but a silent devotion, crafted with hands stained by charcoal, and a heart beating in harmony with roots beneath our feet. Years passed, and the village learned to see the woods through new eyes. The sound of axes was joined by the ring of shovels planting seeds, and children's laughter as they helped sow saplings. The charcoal burner, ever modest, watched from afar with a satisfied air, one who needed no applause. "The forest is not ours," he would say. "We are only its caretakers for a short time." When he spoke those words, even the wind seemed to still among the leaves in agreement. One winter night, by the gentle glow of his kiln, I realized how much his lesson extended beyond his craft. As warmth filled the small cottage and the smell of burning wood permeated the air, he confided that he no longer feared the day he could no longer fell trees. "What matters," he said, staring into the embers as if looking into time itself, "is that we leave something for those who come after." That night, with only the fire's crackle for company, I felt such profound peace that doubt had no place. With age, his steps grew slower, but his presence never waned. Each dawn, he still walked to the forest's edge, touched the bark of an old oak, and murmured his silent greeting. There was something eternal in that gesture, as if the world might crumble, yet that simple touch would forever bind man to earth. I followed in silent companionship, feeling the morning chill dissipate in the glow of first light. Somehow, that small ritual seemed to sustain not only the forest's life, but the village's as well. One morning, he paused before a clearing filled with young saplings swaying in the breeze. He stood motionless for a long moment before saying, "Look closely, boy. This is what time does when we learn to wait." And I looked. I saw not only young trees, but the reflection of something greater, a serene balance between work and care, between human hands and deep roots. In that instant, I understood we were not merely saving the forest. It was saving us in return. In later years, the old burner ceased hauling the heaviest loads, but never abandoned the kiln. He devoted himself to guiding younger men who came to learn not only the art of making charcoal, but the reverence due to what grows. I often saw him seated by the fire, eyes half closed, and a barely there smile as he watched flames dance like old companions. "It is not charcoal that sustains the village," he would say, "but patience." And we all knew he was right. When the first snow of that winter fell, he summoned me to his cabin door. The sky was a hush of white, and the forest lay asleep beneath a frosty shroud. "See," he said, pointing, "even in rest the woodland works." I stood beside him in silence, listening only to the soft sound of snow on earth. In that moment, I found deep comfort in the way life repeated itself. Slowly and predictably, like an ancient song that never fades, only shifts with the seasons. At the winter's end, he entrusted me with his final lesson. Seated before the kiln, embers casting a reddish glow on the walls, he said, "One day, all we make will fade, like these flames. But if we plant before we leave, there will always be warmth where we saw only ashes." His words carried no urgency, each landing softly like snowflake on snow outside. I simply nodded, sensing that he spoke not only of the forest, but of all that truly matters. When spring arrived and new shoots emerged, he no longer ventured into the woods. Instead, he sat before his door, gazing at the green line stretching into the distance, as if each leaf were an old friend. And one morning, as the sun gently touched his cabin roof, he passed away without fanfare, leaving only the unlit kiln and a pouch of seeds by the door. There was no grand farewell, only the certainty that the forest would continue to grow with the same patient care he had shown in life. In the days that followed, the whole village began to plant, not because anyone told them, but because it felt the only way to honor his memory. Each seed sown in the earth was a gesture of gratitude, and gradually, the woods breathed deeper once more. Often, as I walk among those young trees, I almost hear his voice mingled with the wind, a gentle counsel that never ceased to echo. "Wait, and the forest will teach the rest." Today, when I pass through clearings and see green stretching beyond sight, I feel his presence, not in charcoal, not in kiln fires, but in the patient silence of trees growing. Whenever the breeze stirs the leaves and the air smells of fresh wood, I remember the old charcoal burner and his simple truth: nothing cared for with love truly disappears. It only finds a more serene way to remain. The baker and the rare bread. Challenges in food production. I remember that time clearly, when winter approached slowly, bringing with it biting cold and the sweet scent of freshly stored hay in the stables. The little village where I lived seemed to sigh beneath the heavy cloak of grey clouds, and the soft crackle of the hearth fire in my modest home warmed the soul during the long nights. I was the baker, a simple man with hands dusted in flour and a heart forever uneasy before the oven that sustained the villagers' lives. Bread. That year, however, wheat was scarce. The harvest had been poor, battered by a late drought and winds that seemed to carry away hopes of abundance. The sacks that came from the fields were few and yellowed, and I felt the weight of responsibility double upon my shoulders. The village depended on that daily bread, the sacred food that nourished bodies and souls weary from labor. And I, having inherited the craft from my father, knew I had to find a solution before despair overcame kitchens and emptied tables. Mornings began early, with the cold air wrapping the dirt streets as I walked to the farmers' homes to negotiate for whatever little wheat they could spare. There was a mixture of worry and resignation in their eyes, men and women tired of a land that had given so little that year. I greeted them with a calm smile, striving to lift their spirits with gentle words and promises that every grain would be used wisely. Trade was slow, and exchanges often involved more than just wheat: a piece of cheese, a dozen eggs, a jar of honey, anything that could add a little more to our loaves. Back at the bakery, I would gaze at the lit oven that now looked smaller amid the scarcity. I had to be creative, blending flours, reusing crumbs, ensuring that nothing went to waste. It was a delicate dance, balancing the meager supply with the need to keep the bread soft and flavorful, as the village expected. Sometimes, when I opened the oven door, a comforting aroma would rise like an invisible embrace, whispering, "There is still hope." Each batch was a small victory, a silent answer to the anguish of difficult days. Voices in the village began to rise in murmurs of impatience. Some complained about the reduced size of the loaves. Others questioned the denser, rougher texture. I understood their dissatisfaction, but I would patiently explain that these were times of trial, and that together we must stretch every crumb to get through the winter. On nights when rest eluded me, I would step outside the bakery and look at the timidly sparkling stars, as if they were candles lit to guide my way. There were days when exhaustion seemed poised to defeat me, when flour was so scarce it barely sufficed for the first batch. In those moments, I recalled the advice of my old master baker, who told me to listen to the oven's silence and respect the rhythm of the flames. So between one sigh and the next, I found the strength to knead the dough with trembling hands, feeling the warmth of hope grow within my chest like the fire-consuming wood, transforming the simple into sacred sustenance. Seeking new ways to preserve the little wheat I had, I began experimenting with ancient recipes brought by travelers or shared around campfires. I mixed barley, oats, and even a handful of wild herbs to add flavor and heft to the bread. The dough became heavier and more rustic, but it carried the earth's strength and many hearts' effort. Gradually, the villagers started to accept this change, recognizing in the bread a story of resilience and care. One frosty morning, when the sun still hid behind the mountains, an elderly woman approached the bakery door with a gentle smile. She carried a basket of fresh eggs and a handful of aromatic herbs. "My son," she said in a trembling voice, "I know these days have been hard, but this is a gift so you can continue feeding our people." It was a simple gesture, yet brimming with meaning, warming my heart more than the hearth's fire. In that moment, I understood that true abundance sprang from solidarity and the affection shared in every act. As weeks passed, that village of wood and clay, shrouded in mist and ancient tales, found a new rhythm. Though loaves remained smaller, they were baked with double the love and care, each piece of bread bearing the flavor of hope and perseverance. Criticism gave way to soft conversations among neighbors, sharing recipes, advice, and restrained laughter around rustic tables. At nightfall, when candlelight trembled through windows and the aroma of fresh bread drifted through the alleys, I felt a profound peace. It was the silent triumph of a community that, even in scarcity, discovered ways to nourish not only the body, but also the soul. And so, with a warmed heart, I let the oven rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new hope. On one of those nights, as I closed the bakery doors, I sat on the threshold with my face illuminated by a silvery moon. The cold breeze carried the scent of earth moistened by recent rain, and in the distance, the soft barking of dogs guarding their homes created a gentle melody. I thought of the calloused hands of the farmers, the firm voices of the women who helped in the village, and of the bread, this simple yet vital symbol that united us in a shared, silent struggle. I recall one particular moment when a timid child entered the bakery, clutching a small copper coin. With bright eyes, the child asked if they could take a loaf for their sick mother. The tenderness and hesitation in that instant touched me deeply. I handed over a warm loaf, knowing that this humble gesture carried the full force of humanity that kept our village alive, even in its darkest hours. Weeks continued to pass, and with them, the cold intensified, frosting windows and making mornings even quieter. The village seemed to drift into a deep slumber, yet the oven's flames never fully died. Each batch, carefully prepared, was a delicate thread that kept the community connected, a constant reminder that despite hardships, we were together. Amid this routine, I learned to heed nature's subtle signals and the wisdom of elders. The wind, which once brought only cold, began to whisper stories of patience and renewal. The trees, denuded by winter, awaited the promise of spring just as we awaited better days, strengthened by the bread and the hope it represented. One serene afternoon, as snow began to fall softly, blanketing the rooftops in white, I received an unexpected visitor. A young traveler, weary yet curious, entered the bakery. His eyes reflected the oven's glow and bore a gentle smile that seemed to carry distant stories. He shared tales of other villages and ancient fermentation techniques I had never heard. Our conversations stretched as long as the crackling embers, and in that unlikely encounter, I felt the spark of creativity reignite within me. Back at work, I drew inspiration from our dialogue to tweak the recipes and experiment with new yeasts that made the bread lighter and more flavorful, even with mixed flours. With each batch, it felt as if a breath of hope swept through the village, warming hearts and easing worries. Thus, through old tricks and fresh discoveries, bread remained a silent symbol of resilience and care, a link between past and present. Days grew longer, and the cold began to yield before the sun's timid rays peeking through clouds. The village slowly awakened from winter's deep rest, and with it, the promise of a more generous, vibrant harvest. From atop a small hill, I watched green shoots emerge in fields and children laughing as they ran down muddy streets, while the bakery exhaled the comforting aroma of bread that, despite hardships, continued to feed dreams. That clear morning, I felt silent gratitude for our journey, for the hands that labored tirelessly, for neighbors who shared what little they had, and for the bread itself, this humble sustenance that taught all of us the value of patience, creativity, and hope. It was a simple yet profound lesson I would carry always, like a gentle, serene memory, perfect for warming cold nights and lulling peaceful dreams. As the sun finally warmed rooftops and streets filled with color once more, the village seemed reborn in every gesture and smile. The oven, keeper of countless cold nights, now buzzed with new energy, bringing forth breads that were more than food. They were symbols of triumph and unity. Each batch was a poem in flour and fire, a celebration of perseverance and community spirit. With spring in full swing, home sills brimmed with flowers, and timid voices gained strength and joy. I, the baker of that small, enduring village, felt at peace, enveloped by simple routines and the certainty that even in the leanest times, hope would always find a way. And so, under a blue sky and the sweet scent of warm bread, another chapter of this gentle, serene memory closed, ready to cradle dreams and greet smiles at dawn. That tranquil afternoon, as the sun set in golden and rosy hues, I sat by the bakery window to gaze upon the village I loved so dearly. Children played in the streets, conversations mingled with the distant strum of a lute, and the aroma of fresh bread filled the air with a silent promise of care and continuity. It was a moment of simple harmony, where past and present wove together in a serene dance. As night fell, covering everything with a cloak of timid stars, I felt deep gratitude for having been part of that story. A story in which bread, with its rustic texture and humble taste, became more than mere sustenance. It became a symbol of resilience, shared love, and enduring hope, even when wheat was scarce and winds blew harshly. And so, wrapped in that silent warmth, I let this memory rest, hoping it would lull gently the dreams that come with the night. The widow and the abandoned plot, struggling for a small refuge. I remember waking before dawn, when the dew still glimmered softly on the little vegetable garden my husband and I once tended. The scent of damp earth rose in delicate wisps, mingling with the sweet perfume of the sunflowers he planted to brighten our mornings. I felt the cold in the air, sharp as the void that settled in my chest when he was gone, yet it also brought a quiet comfort, as if the night breeze itself wrapped me in an embrace. Every carrot plant and every cluster of wild thyme were pieces of our life together, pieces that now only I could nurture. The timid crackle of the hearth in the kitchen signaled the end of silence, beckoning my trembling hands to grasp the hoe once more with the same hopeful resolve I'd always known. As I furrowed the narrow rows of soil, I felt the weight of curious gazes from the neighboring houses. Murmured comments about the lonely widow who insisted on keeping that patch of land against all odds echoed like an unwelcome whisper among the leaves. My hands, once accustomed to the gentle touch of church candles, now bore calluses, gripping the wooden handle with quiet determination. There were days when longing pressed so heavily that it threatened to drain the strength left in me. But a shy smile from my children at dawn reminded me why I fought on. Even under the stern scrutiny of the world, I felt gratitude simply for having that plot, abandoned by time, yet still holding the promise of sustenance and affection. Feeling the sun's gentle warmth, I sifted my hands through the freshly turned earth and sowed small rows of peas. Each seed placed in the furrow was a secret entrusted to the soil, a silent prayer for better days. The sky, painted in pale blue, threatened heavier clouds, but my will to coax life from the ground spoke louder than any storm. The children, barefoot and giggling, helped me water the seeds, turning hard work into a clumsy dance full of tenderness. Sometimes I imagined my husband beside me, adjusting his straw hat and encouraging me with that calm smile I knew so well. In those memories, I found the strength to lift my weary body and face the future with curiosity. As evening fell, I gathered my tools and sat beneath the old oak that generations of ancestors had left standing. I spread a corner of my worn blanket and broke off a piece of still warm bread, generously offered by a friend from the village. A simple gesture that warmed my heart more than the hearth's fire. The strong aroma of the bread, mingled with the sweetness of chamomile tea, brought almost magical comfort. as if I could sip hope itself. Gazing toward the horizon, I saw the outline of the old barn walls, remembering the mornings he called me to share fresh milk. Then I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the breeze deliver memories and calm my anxieties before returning to the labor that, despite its hardships, still held a glimmer of promise. Each dawn brought new trials. One morning I found pieces of wood deliberately placed in the furrows, perhaps to thwart my work. Another day I heard men's muffled laughter in the distance. Still, as I knelt in the fertile soil, I felt a spark of defiance grow in my chest. I recalled every lesson my husband had taught, patience with the season's rhythms, reverence for life's cycles, and I poured that wisdom into every act of sowing, watering, and pruning. In the shade of the mulberry trees lining the orchard, I sought refuge to catch my breath, and among the branches I spotted tiny green fruits timidly appearing, a silent promise that, despite others' schemes, nature still conspired in my favor. When the moon rose, painting the field in silver, I returned home with hands marked by the furrow's ridges and a heart warmed by a sense of duty fulfilled. The nighttime wind carried the leaves' soft susurrations, reminding me that sometimes silence speaks louder than the cruel words of neighbors. Inside the cottage, the hearth's warmth seemed to hold at bay the shadows that crept across every corner of the plot outside. I knelt by the sturdy wooden table and, before tucking my children into bed, whispered a prayer of gratitude for the resilience that had grown within me. Then I let gentle fatigue carry me to rest, confident that at dawn the soil would welcome me again like an old friend, ready to share its secrets and renew our hope. The following weeks brought icy winds and fine rains that turned the paths into thick mud. Wrapped in the wool shawl my mother had given me, I felt each knitted stitch guard me against cold and loneliness. Yet there I was, bent over the beds, wrapping the young plants in makeshift straw blankets to protect them from early frost. With every gust, I remembered his warm laughter echoing among the orchard blossoms, letting that memory heat my body before the world outside closed in like ashes. On such days, the trees' bare branches seemed to murmur ancient tales, whispering that even the harshest seasons pass, giving way to promises of rebirth. One morning I found something unexpected beside the well, a small herb bed that my elderly neighbor had always tended with such care. She had left it there quietly, a sign of silent solidarity. I ran my fingers through the soft earth, breathing in the rosemary and sage's subtle fragrance. That afternoon she came to visit, her wrinkled hands bearing bread and wise counsel, assuring me I wasn't alone on this journey. As the hearth crackled, we spoke of the strength of the women who came before us, and learned together that even when the world seems to conspire against us, unity among determined hearts builds new foundations of hope. The slender pea vines grew into green rose, dancing in the breeze, laying a soft carpet over the once barren soil. Every morning I walked among those fragile stalks, gently tucking loose soil around them, while softly humming the tune my husband used to whistle on hot summer afternoons. The rising sun painted the fields in gold, and dew sparkled like tiny pearls suspended on leaves. In each sprouting shoot, I saw not only food, but a testament to my perseverance and a renewed promise of kinder days ahead. One day, a newly arrived neighbor approached with curious eyes, carrying a basket of pruned branches. "I thought these might help improve drainage," she said, offering that simple yet generous gift. I was surprised by the softened tone in her voice, once cold, now warmed by kindness. I accepted the branches with a shy smile, and installing them in the muddy trenches, felt my plot finally begin to belong not just to me, but to the entire community, which silently began to believe in my cause. The first ripe pods snapped between my fingers like precious treasures kept by the earth. Their sweet, earthy aroma mingled with the herb bed's scent, creating a bouquet of fragrances that warmed the heart. My children ran through the rows, carefully gathering each bean pod and piling them into baskets lined with dry straw. A pang of pride struck me as I watched their bright, soil-smudged faces and wide smiles, as though they had discovered an ancient secret. With each handful of harvest, I recalled the lessons of patience and care my husband had shared, realizing that even in his absence, his words blossomed in every gesture I made. That afternoon, I gathered the villagers around an impromptu table beneath the ancestral oak. On the rustic board, I spread fresh bread chunks, bowls of peas simmered in light broth, and sprigs of rosemary to perfume the stew. Suspicious glances turned warm, and I heard laughter and stories mingling with sips of warm tea. Hands that once whispered criticism now offered quiet applause, and I felt the plot, once marked by loneliness, transform into a gathering place of affection. As the sun gently dipped below the horizon, I carried a bit of food to my porch, thinking that at last the solitary widow had learned to cultivate something even more precious than seeds: collective trust. I felt the first frost of the coming autumn as I stored the last baskets of peas and beans in the makeshift granary. The wood smoke's woody aroma blended with the distant wind's whisper through the boards, reminding me of my husband's instructions on keeping grain dry and protected. Every nailed plank, every gap sealed with packed straw was an act of love and remembrance. I was preserving not only food, but the legacy of our lives intertwined with that land. At night, I tucked rosemary sprigs among the sacks, trusting that their natural oils would ward off moisture and the fear that everything might vanish in a single season. When the snow finally surrendered to the shy breath of spring, I sensed the soil's vigor beneath the melting white blanket. Anxiety gave way to the gentle anticipation of one who knows the season's cycle. Each drop of water running through the furrows was a silent promise of rebirth. I knelt by the earth's soft fissure and drew shallow trenches for the first wheat seeds, feeling the soil's faint warmth on my hands. Looking up at the pale sky, for a moment I thought I heard his laughter mingling with the rain's patter, as though somehow my husband was there beside me, celebrating every new sprout. The swineherd and the herd's ailments. Between practice and uncertainty, I can still smell the dampness of the stable at dawn, when dew still trickled across the worn wooden boards underfoot. I remember stroking the coarse bristles of the pigs, feeling their measured breaths echo against my calloused hands. The night wind carried the whisper of oak leaves, as if the forest conspired ancient secrets around me. By the flickering oil lamp, I watched each animal with near reverence, as though in them lay the very sustenance of my small family. It was a year of grey skies and meagre harvests, when the cold seeped through the seams of my clothing and the earth clung to my bare feet. Seated on a bale of hay, I tasted the earthy flavour of thyme tea my grandmother taught me to brew. Each sip seemed to summon memories of leaves and roots, bringing a fleeting relief to the fatigue weighing on my shoulders. Amid the subtle creaks of the old timber, I prepared for another day of chores and vigilance, unaware of the mystery soon to unfold among my herd. The next morning, a hoarse sigh echoed through the pens, different from the usual grunts of hunger. I noticed one piglet's legs trembling lightly, as though the moon's chill still gripped its bones. Approaching, I saw pale patches across its pink skin, like storm clouds about to burst. The stable's heavy silence tightened my chest, and a distant crow's caw seemed to herald ancient omens. With no veterinarian at hand, I turned to the legends whispered by the village elders, recalling the remedies penned on yellowed scrolls. Under dim light, I leafed through sprigs of sage and bundles of rue, trying to decipher a cure for those fragile bodies. Each drop of dew in the barn sounded like a call to press on, even as doubt nestled beside me. Thus, between silent hope and the creeping uncertainty in every corridor, I began my quest for the herbs said to heal the darkest ailments. Beneath a velvet sky, I traced paths across flooded fields in search of wild herbs sprouting discreetly among the grass. The rustle of leaves guided me like an ancestral whisper, while my boots sank into the morning soft mud. With each handful of thyme and each tuft of woolly mullein, the weight of responsibility pressed against my chest. I recalled Doña Eufrasia, the healer from the neighboring village, whose gentle voice taught me the secrets of the most potent roots. I carried a scrap of parchment, its ink faded by my grandmother's trembling hand. Dew glittered like hidden jewels, and I harvested each leaf with careful fingers, as though guarding a fragile treasure. A lone crow watched me from an ancient oak, as if silently keeping my journey. The cold breeze carried the scent of wet earth, offering me faint comfort against the uncertainty permeating the air. Back in the stable, I steeped the finely chopped leaves in hot water, letting the steam rise in scented clouds. By the flickering lamp, I applied the infusion to the animals' sores, feeling the herb's gentle warmth against their tender hides. A timid grunt from one piglet sounded like awakening from a heavy sleep, and my heart swelled with restrained relief. Even so, with each new dose, I whispered prayers that this old remedy would prove willing to work its magic. In the soft half-light, my trembling hands found strength in my determination to protect what I loved. The distant laughter of village children brought a small smile to my lips, reminding me of the purpose driving me forward. And in the night stillness, surrounded by the herb's earthy aroma, I let myself believe that perhaps we might be spared from this mysterious disease. At dawn, the moonlight filtered through the barn's gaps, casting silver patches on the floorboards. I walked through the pens, noting that some animals stirred with renewed vigor, while others still fought the torpor the sickness imposed. With a handful of fresh herbs, I refined my brew, adding a sprig of boldo to stimulate the appetites of the lazier pigs. Each step echoed on the old wood as I murmured words of encouragement, feeding not only their bodies, but the troubled spirits resting there. The cold wind made the lamp's smoke dance, and I let its faint glow remind me to persist, even when doubts whispered to give up. At sunrise, I brought steaming bowls to the pen doors and watched their silent responses. The weakest lifted its head with a timid grunt, cautiously tasting the pale liquid as though afraid of the unknown. A gentle warmth filled my chest at that sight, and my hands burned with renewed hope. I continued the ritual for several mornings, noting every reaction in a worn-covered notebook, its pages smeared with memories of anguish and faith. Though the path remained uncertain, my heart rested in knowing each small action wove an invisible bond between me and my herd, nourished not only by herbs, but also by the care I held for my piglets. Over the days, I watched relief slowly spread through their restless bodies. Some piglets that had stooped in weakness now rose with wobbly steps, rediscovering the simple pleasure of chewing fresh straw. Others remained slower, as if the illness still clung stubbornly to their veins. That was when I added a handful of lemon balm to the infusion, recalling travelers' tales of its gentle virtue. Its citrus-sweet aroma hung in the barn air, offering an invisible breeze of strength and comfort. I mixed each batch with care, watching the steam swirl beneath the lamp's trembling glow. Every portion offered was like a silent offering to hope, a small act of resistance against another's discomfort. And as I watched the fragrant vapor fill the space, I felt part of something greater, an ancient cycle of healing spanning generations. One clear morning, I listened to the herd with a lighter heart, hearing the cheerful murmur filling the air between the stalls. A young piglet chased its siblings, its renewed energy weaving memories of long-forgotten play. A gentle warmth flooded my chest, as though spring's sun had blended with the herbs I gathered. I let out a deep sigh, acknowledging the subtle power of traditions that offer comfort even in dark times. In that moment, I understood that uncertainty would never fully vanish. but kindness and care could ease the burden of the unknown. As I stroked the glossy coats of my healed pigs, I offered thanks to the wind, the dew, and the roots that guided me. When I closed the stable door, I left a scattering of dried thyme on the threshold, a silent reminder of all we learned together. And so ended another day of challenges and discoveries, wrapped in the serenity that remains even after night falls. I feel the late afternoon sun's gentle warmth on my face as I settle beneath a welcoming old oak near the stable. The rustle of its leaves echoes a tranquil whisper of an ancient song, and I close my eyes for a moment, riding the breeze scented with thyme and lemon balm. Around me, the distant tinkle of a bell tied to a cured pig's neck reminds me gently that life goes on, even after nights of uncertainty. My hands rest on the soft grass, feeling the damp earth beneath my fingers, and I recall every step of my healing journey, a path sown with roots and whispered stories. The far-off crackle of the hearth in the nearby cottage brings a familiar comfort, as though the whole village shares in a collective sigh of relief. In this serene moment, I realize true healing lies not only in herbs, but in the patience we cultivate within our own hearts. With a deep breath, I open my eyes and watch my herd move together in harmony, each animal now free simply to be. In this hushed calm, I find renewed hope etched in every quiet beat of my heart. Later, I wander through fields where wild poppies bloom quietly among the medicinal herbs that saved us. I pick some stalks of black mint, recalling cold mornings when the steam of its teas warmed my soul before it warmed my bones. As I lay leaves out to dry on a clean cloth, the weight of responsibility dissolves, replaced by silent gratitude. Each green leaf in my hand bears witness to ancestral knowledge, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren through the centuries. The soft glow of dusk paints the sky in golden hues, and I understand that just as day yields to night, our lives alternate between trials and solace. I return to the stable with light steps, ready to offer my creatures not just remedies, but the tenderness only someone who cares with love can give. Closing the wooden door for the last time that day, I smile with certainty that, in the face of mystery and fragility, gentleness always finds a way. One soft night, fine drizzle falls as I retrieve the leftover infusion bucket on the barn's threshold. The steady murmur of rain on the thatched roof sounds like a soothing chant, lulling my memories of this healing journey. Inside, the animals rest with renewed calm, their flanks rising and falling in steady breaths. The oil lamp casts trembling shadows on the damp boards, and I let my gaze linger on each rosy face, recognizing my own hope reflected there. Seated on the threshold, I breathe in the herb's sweet scent still pulsing in the air, recalling every root gathered in the fresh grass. I remember my grandmother's calloused hands teaching me to respect nature's silence and listen to its healing whispers. The rain persists, as if wishing to wash not only the barn's dust, but also the doubts that once threatened my faith. In that moist, tranquil moment, I realized even the sky in its tears joined the simple miracle of renewing life. At the next day's dawn, I felt a distinct lightness crossing the dew-soaked courtyard. The pigs gathered near the watering trough, curiously sniffing at the rain's gentle echo, as though each old drop still warmed their bodies. Gently, I swept away the mud from the tired boards, each motion imbued with the silent gratitude welling in my heart. A villager passed by with a basket of eggs, and seeing me smiled in recognition of the sincere light in my eyes. She whispered admiration for my strong, healthy animals, and in that brief encounter, I felt part of a caring network extending beyond the stable walls. I returned inside to the hearth's faint warmth, letting the infusion cool for the next day's healing rounds. Setting down my gathering tools on the wooden shelf, I gave thanks to the herbs, the dew, and the very mystery that guides us at every step. Life, I realized, flows serenely when we care for one another with patient tenderness. One autumn day, I faced the fallen leaves carpeting the ground around the stable in golden hues, reminded of how gently time transforms. I collected comfrey seeds while walking among the now lifeless trees, their bark wrinkled like hands recounting years gone by. The wind carried a sharper chill, and I wrapped my shawl tightly, sensing its rough weave embrace my tired body. My grandmother spoke of comfrey seeds as my next experiment long ago in dreams, promising their healing powers would convince even the deepest wounds. Carefully, I separated each seed, remembering lessons of patience and persistence my calloused hands knew so well. I left the seeds to dry on a cloth under the late sun as the village prepared to store wheat for the coming winter. The mingled scent of dry earth and dead leaves rose in thin spirals, a fragrant reminder that even death carries a promise of rebirth. In that autumnal silence, I felt my spirit anchor itself to the earth, steady and serene, ready to face cold nights warmed by each small cure we had achieved together. At dusk, I gathered curious children by the stable gate, telling them of each herb that saved our piglets. Their eyes shone at tales of rue, thyme and lemon balm, and a silent joy blossomed in my chest as I passed down these ancient knowledges. I handed them leather-tied bundles of dried sprigs, advising them to keep a pinch by their windows to ward off nightmares and anxieties. The innocent smiles on their faces reminded me of my own childhood, running barefoot through fields, believing the world was made of endless possibility. As tiny laughter spread through the courtyard, I understood a healer's true legacy lies not in what we learn alone, but in what we share with others. The sky turned purple and crimson as I lit one final lamp before entering the warm cottage next door. There, with the soft grunts of resting piglets and the gentle scent of dried herbs, I laid my head on the straw pillow, knowing uncertainty still dwelled among us, but that care and kindness would always find a path. And so, wrapped in memories and age-old promises, my trust in life's everyday miracles was reborn. Sleep well until our next journey among ancient echoes and slumbering memories.